Good morning, Dr. Telfair.
Morning. Morning. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm
Good.
good. We're about 6 after now.
hmm
Do you want to wait a few more minutes or shall we get started?
it's up to you. I think Miss Rachel said we were have less people today, so it's really your call. The first part of this is actually Q&A for a little bit anyway, so it's really up to you.
I would say let's make good use of the time that we have this
hmm
morning with the folks that are on, and I'm sure we'll have a few more join as we get along in this first part. So um, if you're ready, I'm ready.
Okay. I definitely am.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're glad that you're here. Um, I think we may have a couple of people that may join that or maybe on that were not on last week. And so welcome. Um, so Dr. Joseph Telfair from Georgia Southern is leading our discussion this morning and the training. So you see before you the agenda for today. And I'm going to yield to Dr. Telfair to get us started on the Q&A.
Okay. Well, welcome and thank you all. Thank you, Ms. Roberts, and welcome everyone. So today, as you can see, I'm just going to go over the agenda briefly, um, so that we're real clear as to what we're going to be doing today. So first, this morning is just a brief. If you have any pending questions or questions that were left over from the first day, or additional questions, we'll cover this morning. We are going to start and recover some of the information that we did go over on sort of your for monitoring evaluation for your grant application and what you need to know there. We will then spend some time going over the conclusions in terms of the logistics and information that you need for closing out the latter parts of what's normally asked in a grant application. Then we will have another short question and answer just to review any outstanding questions for that day. First of all, and then we'll take a break. And then when we come back, we have the breakout leaders will work with you. If you notice in the fourth column, it says slides and handouts. So just to clarify, the handouts, uh, normally we would be what's now we put in your appendix, because normally these will be handed out to you in person if we were together. However, we're not, so they're in your appendix, and they're just two elements: one walking you through how to recommendations from another esteemed person on how to conduct an intervention-based type of grant development, and then the second part are just the ways of looking at assessment. They are alternatives to logic models, and if you have questions, I can go over those briefly. The breakout session itself is going to focus on the key question is one really big question is to answer is how can I use what we have learned to apply to what I have brought. So remember, we asked everyone to bring either a proposal with them or something they're working on with them. And so the point is to take the information, and every one of you, we did send out in advance all the slides and everything. So you should have those in front of you. The breakout session persons will walk you through and basically facilitate the use of that information. And our hope was, if we were in person, whole lot easier. So please bear with us a little bit as we try to adjust. What we want you to be able to do is use that information and have that to inform what you're working on, and then use the facilitators to ask questions, help them to the problem solve, walk through how can I use this part of this slide for this question, and so on and so forth. So we want it to be a highly interactive breakout session where you're using all the materials in front of you, as well as and I'll review this again right before the breakout sessions, but that's what we want to do. So and then we'll come back and have a very brief wrap up and closure on that part. And then we'll have any additional follow-up information. We want to also bring your attention to a piece of information that Ms. Rachel McConaughey sent you uh, as a participant on the work, and if she wants to say a little about that, what that additional information from the agency was, at this point, we could do that, ma'am, Miss Rachel.
Hi, so that was just a handout. United Way has that funding network, and it is a very useful tool, especially if you're trying to locate funding in the first place. It's almost like a Google search of funders. So if you'll have to contact United Way for the remote access link since they are still out of the office for COVID. But once you go into the funding network, it's almost like a search bar, and you can search education or recidivism or transportation, and it will bring up a list of previous grants that have been awarded, foundations that typically give money for that. I mean, it really is a great resource, especially just to locate funding in the first place.
Okay, thank you. So, having said that, we have a few minutes before we get started. Do we have any review questions or questions that are outstanding from anybody on the call, particularly if you participated last Friday with what we have? Please speak up if you have questions. Or if you have questions about the agenda for today. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Do we have anything in the chat at all? No. Okay, so I guess we'll just go ahead and get started then. Me.
Dr. Telfair, if you could also, if people have printed off the slides,
Uh-huh.
if you could cue us on which slide you're on.
Sure, I would
But
definitely do that. Okay, not a problem. All right, so here is a slide. So we're in slide, you're at slide 51. That's where we're starting today. So I'll give everyone a chance to go to that slide, slide 51. Okay, Ms. Roberts, can we see the screen with the slide? Great. Okay. All right. So, well, we're starting today. This is slide 51. And so far, what we've covered we've covered the introduction, we covered some background considerations for putting the grant application together, responding to the RFA, FOA, RFP, and we've defined all those terms for you. And we then thought through, we had a checklist of considerations of working together. We then walk through what should be considered as you are writing and orientating the persons who are going to be reviewing your application to what it is that you're thinking about, what you want to cover, how you hope to respond to the challenge or to the foci of the actual RFA, FOA, RFP, and how you want to do that, what your preliminary information is and your understanding of that will be. Then what the background section of how you have defined and put together the information that you have and what you want to present and how you want to cover it. So we've covered all those bits. And then we're moving into the methodology. And so there's a couple parts to that. The first third of the methodology is presenting what it is, how you hope to carry out the work and respond to what it is that you said you're going to do in terms of your aims, your objectives, your goals, and so forth. And so the second element of that is what we're going to cover starting today, which is the monitoring and evaluation of the work itself. And we went over that started a little bit, but I want to review this because this is an area where it's generally a bit of a challenge. So let me walk you through this. So just so that you have an understanding, when you think about monitoring and evaluation within the context of a grant, it is important that you understand why it's there in the first place. So what you see before you is a brief uh, definition of what a monitoring evaluation for a program is. There are, as you know, depending on the type of application you have, there are monitoring and evaluations for individual efforts in terms of individual clinical services and so forth you have. And then there are other types of assessment. They're primarily for those in the not-for-profits. They generally have a bigger program, and then they have services under that program. So what I'm going to focus on is how those are linked together and how you would craft the language that you would use on this one. And I'm going to do this more as an introduction. There's another huge presentation to come at another time on walking you through how to actually do all the work for an evaluation. But understand, this is just an introduction to the language that helps you craft what you would put in to a grant application. So the definition here gives you an idea of what it is that you're going to cover. And there are keywords throughout this definition was assessment, approach, technique, knowledge, tracking, improving the plan, implementation, and effectiveness. Now, the idea is that all of these things should be in your mind as you think about how you might want to use this. So why you want to put this into your program? You want to be able, remember we said before, if we look at it from the point of view of the person reviewing your application, what they want to know is, do you have an idea of why it is that you're putting together what you've put together? And do you have an idea of what it is you're trying to achieve, what you will accomplish, the when and the how, and besides the why? And so what evaluation helps you to do is to provide them with levels of assurance that the program that you proposed with all the services to go with it is going to be effective. The program that you propose is going to provide them with the information that they need to understand what the program is going to be, to provide you with the information you need to determine if the program itself is working the way you think it should, and then those that are working with you, that same assurance. It will allow you then to also have oversight so that you're able to monitor or follow through with the program itself to make sure that it is a program that is accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish, and that that whatever you're doing is keeping the program on track. So even if things are not working out as you thought they should with this effort, which happens all the time when we do clinical work, it allows you to sort of take a step back, use your judgment, and say, how can we make those adjustments? How can we look at the effectiveness question, and how can we make sure that what we're intending to do, serve our clients, do the work that we said, is working itself? And then it will also help you to work with those that you are collaborating with, for the most part, on your program, provide in-depth or relevant reporting on the work you're trying to do. The other part of it is that it allows you then to plan and document the things that you need to put into the program. What is it that you need? What are the personnel parts that you need? What are the types of documentation and other work that you need? What are the other partners that you need to pull together for the program itself? What are the types of programs or services that you need to structure to make sure the work is getting done? It allows you then to assess these activities in a way that gives you feedback to determine what's going on and how it's worked. And then it helps you to make decisions on what's working and what's not, the gaps and the challenges, and then how you might have some information driven or evidence driven approaches to resolving those challenges and through troubleshooting the information itself. And in those troubleshootings are informed. They're not just guessing this might work or that might work, but you actually have information to say that will tell you to how, if we resolve this information using what we've learned, but then we can make sure that the outcomes they're trying to get is what we're shooting for. It allows you then to provide that information to yourself in the reports you are required to do, and it assures those reviewing that you're going to collect those types of information and that the outputs of the program, the results, the things that you're trying to accomplish will be reported in such a way and in such a manner that they're going to allow you to report accurately and provide evidence that the program works. Now, what I showed you before, and then I went over it really quickly, so I have time this morning to kind of go over it a little bit more. So let me back up for a quick second and say, so what you're looking at here is how do you use the information to do these things, to troubleshoot, to provide program data, and to do the reports. So what you want to have is you want to have some kind of structure for which you want to work that, and you want to be able to demonstrate to those that both are reviewing this and making a decision about whether they're going to fund you or not, to your staff, to the people yourself and people working with you, and then as you move to decide to learn from from whatever it is you've been funded for, and then how can you use that information for future work and future references. So you want to be able to do that. So here is a one of several tables that I've put in here in PowerPoint form to help you with that type of work. So first of all, why and what are you going to focus on for the evaluation itself? And remember, I'm using the evaluations kind of broadly here. What I should have said in the framing of that, it should say framing of the monitoring and the evaluation. So let me repeat that. It should say framing of the monitoring and the evaluation, because monitoring will tell you whether the program is working the way it should. Evaluation will tell you that if you have an intervention, that the intervention is producing the change that you desired it would have. So those are the two things. So first of all, it should be based on evidence. So whatever your needs are and whatever that information is that you have, that you've used to justify why it is you're applying for this application is there. Second of all, you want to discuss the context that the monitoring evaluation is taking place in. And what I mean by that is that, so use our example of the urban rural health program that is focusing on young persons with asthma. So you have two settings. You have a rural setting and an urban setting. And so the service is being delivered in those two different settings. So that means that they're going to be contextual or setting based type of considerations that you have to make. Anytime you have an assessment, that needs to take those into account, because the settings themselves, many times they're going to dictate, how what's going to happen in a program in terms of how services are received, for example, what kind of people are going to be available to support those services, for example, and so forth. And we know from our own experience that these will manifest themselves differently if you're in an urban setting, say a Savannah or a similar setting, than you are, say, or a Bryan County type of area, which is right outside that is of Chatham, or in the unincorporated areas of Chatham where it's more rural, is going to be a challenge different ways. So do your monitoring assessment needs to document that. And then you need to use that information to take stock or assess, what is available resources that we have to both that we either have or what we will need in order to make that work. And then you design your program strategies. You design how you're going to carry this out. You're going to make it work. Which means that you're going to come up with your goals and your objectives. And I'll show you in a minute about objectives and give you an idea of what's a SMART objective, which is an overview of what to think about. And this should be familiar, very familiar to many of you, particularly you all who do service-based work or business-based work. But choosing your goals and objectives need to be consistent with what you have identified as the needs of the program. So if it's an asthma-based program for young adults with special needs, then and you're doing this with partners that are out in the community, what is it that they have in place in terms of assets, and then what is it that they would need to work with you to carry this program out so that you all are effectively delivering services to these young persons. So you're working on those things. You define your objectives, and they should be SMART objectives, and I'll hold off in a minute on that, so because I'm going to go over that with you, but just know that that needs to be important. The questions or the things you're trying to figure out, which are going to be your monitoring evaluation questions, should be generated as well as what it is you're going to measure. So are you going to measure simply whether or not the persons that you targeted received the services, yes or no, the type of services they had, what they thought about the services, or what kinds of challenges you have in delivering the services, and then what's the results? What are the outcomes of the delivery of those services? What is it that you're going to look at? So in other words, then your question, there should be a straight line between your goals and your objectives, and then what it is you're trying to ask, and then what it is that you're going to be measuring or assessing in terms of that, which brings you to building your evidence. Critically to reviewers, any type of plan you have or any type of work you do, they will ask you this, either put a monitoring evaluation section together, or they will do something which they will call to provide us a work plan. And many of you know that because you've seen it before. And in the work plan is laying out sort of some of it they'll ask you to do it as maybe a logic model. Some of it they'll ask you to do it as a structural model. Whatever it is, what they're trying to get at is to answer the question, show us how you're going to carry the work out, and how you're going to assess the work that you're doing, and how you're going to know that the work you're doing is accomplishing what it said you're going to do. How you're going to carry it out, how you're going to assess it, how you're going to determine what it is you're trying to do. So that's what that evidence building part of that is. So that means that you have to make sure that you've identified what it is you're going to use to have that information. So what are the records going to be? What kind of information collection documents you're going to have? And then the who and the what, and then how part of that or you're going to need. So who's going to collect it? How are they going to collect it? How are they going to use it? How are you going to use it? How are you going to make decisions from it? Those type of things. And they want you to lay those out as clearly as you possibly can. And then also, when you focus on the activities, the work that's being carried out, the steps that are being taken, those types of things, they really want to know how it is that you're looking at those things based on the record. So going back to the records, are you going to interview people? Are you going to conduct surveys? Are you going to pull documents, existing documents together? Are you just going to have people give you input? Those are the things. So those last two bullets and finding the evidence are just examples of how you might think about providing the information you need for generating the information that you would need for that part. And then the last part of this, in terms of the plan itself overall, is just looking for how you're going to make sense of the information. So what is it that you're learning? What are the key ideas and concepts you're coming together? What are the themes that you're learning? So if you are providing information to the same population essentially, but in two different settings, one a rural, one an urban, what are the things that you see that are similarities? What are the things that you see are differences? And that's just not just that's a service delivery bit, but what is it that you see also in how you as a program over time has adjusted to those differences and those challenges, and how what have you done? So what is been consistent? You know, do you find you need to add more community workers to the rural areas and less to the urban areas, or do you need to do more training with the persons in a different setting, so forth? What are you learning from the persons who are receiving the services? Are they actually able to get the services all at once, as you had as you had planned? Do they need to you need to break services up so that they can work on this? Do they need to have more priority sessions, say for so asthma supplies versus checkups, so on and so forth? So these are the kinds of things that you will you in making sense of what you've learned in terms of the information and interpreting that information and then putting that information together, and then having a structure that allows you then to report your results, that where your audience for the results. So remember, reporting of results is for multiple audiences. That includes yourself, you and your team, your partners, the persons are funding you, and I would add, importantly, the persons you're serving as well, being creative. And that, a lot of times that gets lost in the translation. So reporting to yourself and to your partners in terms of that, reporting to the persons who are funding you, but also to the people and constituencies that you are serving. And there's many reasons, you all know this probably better than me, why it's important that those receiving services understand how the program and how the services are being delivered, why they work and why they're there. And you'll be able to learn from them and use that information to then make improvements and changes. And so and that would also allow you, particularly if you want to keep the program up and running, what do you learn from that that you can demonstrate your next grant cycle? How you can use that information, how it might work. And then the other big piece is so critically important. You had a reason to apply for this. You had a reason to do this that fits with your mission, your values, and so forth. How's it doing? How did it work? What is the information there? So this framework, which is overview of measurement and evaluation process, gives you talking points, give you thinking points, gives you areas in which you might want to think about it. So in a nutshell, it just walks you through, it gives you some idea of what that section should look like. And let me give you a little bit more information. So as I showed you before, as you're thinking about it, there are components to a monitoring and evaluation program that you should keep in mind. And there are four components. First of all is accountability, to the program itself. Did the program achieve what it is that you intended it to achieve? And then are your objectives being met as you intended them to be met? And this is a question that not only will you have, but those funding you will definitely have. And if you are able to demonstrate in your grant application that you a clear pathway to show that you have accountability, that is going to make a big difference in the work itself. You all who were on the call the last time may recall the suggestion that I made. Many of us are really good at stating what it is the issue of the problem is. We do that really well. And so the first parts of this that I went through, which is the introduction and background, my suspicion is that you all would be really good at writing that part and really get people's attention. Reviewers appreciate that. They do. However, what they also appreciate is that you're able to say how you're going to account for and use the resources that they provide you, be it money, be it other resources. And so you do need to have a plan like this. So accountability is critical. The other part of it is to demonstrate what knowledge that you have. So if you know that there are challenges to provide services to young persons with asthma in rural settings, what do you know about that? And what can you make sure that the monitoring and the evaluation is targeting those particular key indicators, the things that will tell you that you're really addressing based upon what you knew and what you talked about in your introduction and background section, and then how you're pulling that together. So for your program, what kind of services are you putting together to make sure that overall you're addressing that? And then how do you plan to put this together? And how you plan to track this and refine these activities? What I went through before about building evidence and then putting that information together is what's you're going to need to do. In the appendix, I give you three different examples, and we'll go over that a little bit after this, later before we go if you have questions. But there's three slides that I cover a way to do this that I think would be really helpful to you: the program achievement matrix and the program tracking matrix, which is essentially the part that I showed you earlier about how you're going to pull the information together. And then the thing that you and the funders want to know: how do you know that you've addressed the gaps and the challenges? And if you are going to address the gaps and challenges and you have identified them, how are you resolving, how you're going to either fix them or make or refine them? Because there may be some issues you cannot do, like fix roads. That may not be part of your job, particularly if you're delivering services in an urban setting or rural setting. That may not be this within the scope. But are you also then, if you have identified that fixing roads or identify that transport is an issue, are you have a plan of how you will speak with and work with those who it is their job, the DOT in your area, or the city services in your area, or whatever? Do you have that as part of the work you want to do? And then what did you learn about that? And if you did that or plan to do that as part of it, what lessons did you learn? And I can tell you, as someone who's reviewed all types of grants, being proactive about how you might learn from what you do and how you might use that information really, really allows reviewers to get a sense that you have some really good insights about what's going on, and that will raise your application above the 150 other applications who literally want to receive funding for the same thing when they can only fund 30. So that kind of insight, that kind of information is demonstrating to them that you're clear about what to really do. And if you can demonstrate that pathway from what it is you're asking about and what you said you're going to do to the work itself, and then what your anticipated challenges and issues might be, and how you might use those to better and to make decisions and to better your effort and so forth, that is a big piece. So it is critical to be proactive and to think through that. And it's not, despite what I think in some areas that says talking about your weaknesses. No, your weaknesses are weak only if you don't have solutions or recommended solutions and that are actionable. So you may make recommendations of how you might address those, but they need to be realistic and actionable. Realistic and actionable, and that actually is a weakness to a strength, even if it's limited. So that happens a lot. A lot of service programs for not-for-profit programs are really limited by their own resources. That's fine. People know that. Trust me, the reviewers themselves are experienced and knowledge, but they know that. But that's not their question. What their question is, do you know that well enough to articulate it and to talk about how you will use the resources you're going to get, and then to the maximum of those resources? And then what do you think you'll be able to cover to what degree or not? Because some agencies and philanthropic organizations, large not-for-profits who who do grant funding, always have the expectation, and many of you know this, that their resources are not going to cover 100% of what you need. They're going to provide you with as much as they can, but there's an expectation that you will do what you can and then also match it, maybe not match it financially, but some other way. And that's an expectation to do this. So they would want to be able to see that. No, they're not expecting you to cover everything with what they give you. They know they cannot. There's that money is limited. There's not unlimited. Resources are limited. But the idea is what can you use? So talking about what you see the gaps and the challenges are, talk about how the resources are going to help to resolve those, how you're going to learn from that, and then how you're going to move forward are all very critical. So I cannot emphasize that enough. Now, SMART objectives, as I said before. So the general term is SMART objectives, and I would just say this is what it stands for: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and then time-based. Okay, so what I put into the slides is this table here to help you kind of understand what that means. Now, why do you have the SMART objectives? So SMART objectives or as I said before, you have aims and and goals. Those are expected to articulate and to really make clear what you really like to achieve. What objectives allow you to do is to demonstrate how you're going to make that work. And so you need to be very clear about that. So this is where the concept of SMART objectives come in. The writing of those is that for example, for specific, uh, it varies in either a simple, succinct, or strategic approach you're going to have. And it answers the question: is there a specific behavior or activities or effort that is linked to some numerical value, some intent, and so forth? And it wants you to be very, very clear that you want to do this. So for our asthma example, we would want to say we want to provide services. I'll give you the general part of that: services to adolescent and young adults between the ages of 13 and 18 years old who live in the Chatham area or the Chatham County area or the Bryan County area to receive services. So that's the general bit. I'll add more as we go. The next thing is that you need to show how you're going to make it measurable. So the idea there is what is manageable, meaningful, and maintainable. So in your previous trainings around SMART objectives, the idea here is that what you're going to measure is something you will actually be able to get. So are they going to come from records of one type or another? Or are you going to ask questions in interviews of one type or another, and so forth? And then what is it that you're going to ask them? Are you going to ask them about the ability to participate in the services or not? Or are you going to focus on how you're going to do this? So, for example, you're saying that you're going to provide services to these adolescents and young adults, 13 to 18 years old, and that will include transportation services that include working with community-based workers and so forth. And so what are you going to achieve? And then you're going to achieve that the services will move up from a baseline of participating services of 10%. And by the end of your 5 years, that baseline will move up to 35%. So it's that kind of way. And then is that achievable? Can you do this? And then in your objective, you will say through the work with, and then you can name whether other agencies you're going to work with, or you're going to work with families, you're going to work with other people. But what you're trying to do here is make sure that whatever you're doing, it's reasonable, it can be done, that reviewers can say, okay, I can see how they're going to do that. And then your objectives need to make sure that it's relevant. So we said last week that one of the things it's critically important for you to do is to demonstrate that your agency, your partners all together are or have the capacity of one way, shape, or form, in one form or another, I should say, to carry out the work that you have. And so right now with this with the resources you're going to get, how's that going to enhance what you have to do, knowing that you're not going to do everything again, but it will enhance that. So what is the relevance of that, and then relevance to your organization? And I think that's I am convinced that that is important, because what your mission statement, what your values are, and it based on the funders perspective in terms of what their missions and value are, and then line that up with what you're trying to do, that will assure them that you're going to do this. And then of course, what is the time frame? And so for this example, you can say by the end of the funding period. So that will be, so if they started funding you in the fall of 2020 and it's a 5-year proposal, it'll end at the end or right before the beginning of the fall of 2024 and so forth. So you all have this in front of you, and you have the steps to that and have it in front of you. The other part of this is that, of course, in the grant application, all they want to see is what the objective itself looks like. And so we can work on that. So I can stop here to see if there's any questions, any examples. We'll go from there, see if there's any questions or examples. You can either put the question in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask.
Dr. Telfair, I've got a question. I think that just during this pandemic, we've had to rethink how we evaluate, because a lot of our evaluation has always, it's to some extent evaluation. We collect data, right?
Right.
And then there's the qualitative data that we want to collect, which has become, in some estimation, it's become harder to do that part of it, given where we are with the pandemic. So if if you would say, I think we're all trying to adapt to how we collect data differently, and making sure that we get data and that we do it in a safe way, so that some of the data that we need to collect, for instance, in food distributions and things like that, when we're reaching, who are we reaching, and what's the data that we want to collect from them. How we do that is sometimes more challenging. So I just wanted to bring that up and get your thoughts about that as one. And then I had a colleague share with me a couple of weeks ago, sent me a different sort of riff off of the SMART goals, and they were SMARTY goals that included inclusion and equity
Mhm.
on them. And we know that in our communities right now, especially, I would say in our communities, that that's a lens that we always want to be looking for, is how are we being inclusive in the work that we're doing, and making sure that we have an equity lens
Mhm.
as well.
Okay.
What are there other questions out here? Or comments?
Okay. I can address those, and um, I can address those um, if people are thinking. So on the first one, yeah. So the thing is that how to be creative at what we have in terms of the work that we're doing. So it's the reality is, for community, for us who do not for profit work. I'm sorry. Hang on a sec. Apologies, there's a lot of noise in the background. But anyway, so on the and then for not-for-profits, it's always a challenge on designing and collecting information, which is something that we will cover once we do our other workshop. But in brief, what we're trying to look at is how do we, the key word here is adaptation, and how do we kind of make that adaptation. And the other part of this is that you want to make sure that there's a line you don't cross in terms of quality and veracity of your information, which is very easy to do, to compromise too far. You don't want to do that. So having said those two things, I just want to keep that in mind with my comment. So the situation we live in now, for example, we had to do that. We've had work where a majority, particularly us to do community-based work, we're very much accustomed to the face-to-face meeting. We all our work itself is just literally sitting around a table talking to people, knocking on doors, walking up to people in different places, people coming to us for services. That's sort of what we do. We're driven that way, and it's you know it's a withdrawal, I several of us were sort of lamenting the other day that we're jonesing for social contact. I mean, that's our thing. We're jonesing for social contact. We really miss that. So what we have to be able to do, though, is go back to what we know fundamentally about communicating with others we know, and to really try to get a sense from at least some of the other people, is ask them, we have different types of information and we have to make these adjustments. What would be some ideas on how to really do that? So taking a step, the thing about it is a good person, a data person, will recognize when there are challenges. And I use the word challenges in terms of problems, because challenges are things you can overcome. Problems are a lot of times things you can't. So the challenge of the data means that taking a step back, going back to really reaching out to people, who can inform us, maybe the folks we work with, a few of them, other people, and say, what other ways can we gather information from persons? Do we have to make adjustments? Do we people who have this type of video contact do more interviews over video if we can? If they don't have that, do it over the phone, because pretty much everybody has a phone. And or do it through the way that, say, reporters do, which is they knock on doors, they have long microphones, they do other things. So coming up with creative ways that people still feel comfortable, they're able to keep the distance and deal with that work. That's one kind of area to work with. And or the other part of it is breaking up how we do the work. Instead of getting all our information at once like we're accustomed to do, we may need to break it up over time. This is what we had to do in a recent project. We had a set of information that is both quantitative and qualitative in terms of type of data. But because we didn't have the time as well as the opportunity would not present itself, we had to break it up into components. So break it up into phases and to gather information itself. So the point is that be adaptive, use the skills that you know, use what you know as a not-for-profit person who knows how to work with other people. What do your partners say? What are they doing? How are they working it out? Do you need to use other means? Do you need to support persons, enhance their ability to communicate with you instead of it being a one-way part? Do you need to provide resources for them to be able to do, like record? They get recorders, and then they answer your question via recorders. Do they do other ways? That's how you do this. And so it means expanding a bit. It means being more adaptable a bit, but it really means keeping with the fundamentals on how you communicate with persons, how do you gather information from persons, and keeping as a priority, making sure that those persons are feeling comfortable. So that's answer to your first question, at least from where I sit. Answer to your second question. It is a given, uh, by the type of groups and people that we work with, that we want to make sure that we have a major representation of the persons that is or who we are serving that we gather information from. That is a given. That is should be a given in any type of position you have. So that inclusion part should be something that is not a second thought. That is should be a primary and always part of what you have on that part. The other bit is an example that I've been using, which is the rural urban kind of differences. Now, Robert Wood Johnson, if you don't know, has this phenomenal illustration of the difference between equality and equity. Equality means that everybody gets the same. So if the point of it is that everyone should have a bike, then equality means that everyone will get a bike. If people need a bike, equality says we're going to give everybody a bike, and that bike will look like a regular old two-wheeler, whatever it is you're going to do. Equity means that because not everybody is the same, in other words, either physically or other types of characteristics, those characteristics are going to dictate the type of bike they're going to have. Some of them are going to have a regular old, two-wheeler and stand alone. Some of them are going to have a three-wheeler because they don't have balance issues. Some of them have height issues and so on and so forth. So the idea behind that is that you want to achieve equity. That is that is necessary, but is not sufficient. Equity is what you're really shooting for, to make sure that everybody has the equal opportunity to participate in what it is you're trying to do. So it goes back to what I was saying about adapting to our current situation. Because our current situation does not affects everyone, but not everyone in the same way, which means that adaptation will allow you to achieve equity. And that means you have to leave room in what you're going to do. So if it normally takes you an hour to do something, because you're now having to adapt, it may take you 2 to 3 hours. Then you adjust your schedule, you adjust your work, so on and so forth. So anyway, that's how, to me, I see the blending of what it is that you just said. I hope that answers your question, Ms. Roberts. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Ms. Conley,
Yes, good morning.
good morning.
I have a question. When you were talking about evaluation and how things have had to change, when you are writing a grant, do evaluators, when they're reading it, do they want to know like, hey, we've collected this data, this is how we've collected it. Now we've had to switch our mode of how we collect the data. Do they care how you once collected it and now how you're collecting it now? Is that important to show when you're writing these grants?
That's a really, I'm sorry.
No,
Were you
I was just saying with how things are changing. That's how I was.
Right. Yeah. So that's a very good question. And so the answer is always, that's a question that you always have independent of our time, right? And they always want to know that because remember, I don't know if you were on the call. Were you on the call last week? Okay. So you remember what I said. The one constant about communities is that they change.
Right.
So reviewers know that, they recognize that, they understand that. Their expectation is that you understand that you are paying attention to that. So it's pretty clear when you make a proposal that at the time, this is what our situation is. But then you put your annual report together, you say, oh, this is what happened, right? So for example, 2019, you had a clear way we're going to do this. And then up until February of 2020, you were cool. And then COVID hit. And then it was like nothing, crickets. And now we are slowly rolling back, right? Everybody gets that. However, what their question is going to be is how well do you understand how this situation has affected your situation? And do you put together a reasonable adjustment? So it's not so much do they understand, or that their expectation is that you understand it, first of all. Second of all, that whatever adjustments you make are clear and reasonable. So if you've had to adjust that your mission and your intent is going to stay the same, but how you're going to go about it, you've made adjustments that allows you to do that. So that's where it comes in. So the answer is yes, They expect that, but these are the two things they expect: that you get it and you can put that and rationalize it, and then secondly, that you be able to demonstrate in a reasonable way that's sound, that's consistent, that's evidence based. How you're going to do that? Did that answer your question, ma'am?
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you very much.
No problem. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you. So then I'll move on. So basics, then I'm just going to go over a little bit of the basics for this section, and then give it. So this kind of speaks to some of the questions that we had. So the implementation of the monitoring and evaluation of your program itself is designed to both document and track what your inputs, and we describe those, and what it is you're going to carry out, which is which is what the results your service is going to be at regular intervals. Now, in the appendices, I provided you with two ways to do that. One is your program tracking matrix, which is focused mostly on your monitoring part, and then your program achievement matrix, which is tracking that is more evaluation. And then, and wherever we want to do this, it's there. So it's in the appendix. And if we get to that part and you want me to walk you through it, I'm happy to do that. Just speak up, make a note to yourself, and we'll go back. Now, should you develop a plan? So when do you develop your evaluation plan? As I said in the last week, 8 or 9 out of 10 times when we are asked to assist with an evaluation, it is generally a program or a set of services that have either been funded or it already in the works. And for us, we are expecting that. However, reviewers and the grant persons you're seeking funding from, there's two conditions there. There are times when they do not ask you for it, and then there are times when they do. So I can't speak to, honestly, the typical, because the typical in our day and time has been modified many ways. However, I can tell you that if you are applying to any kind of state or national or global agency, they are definitely going to ask you to put an evaluation together of one type or another. And they will either ask you for a more formal one or an informal one. And informal ones are like, they want to ask you for a work plan or a logic model. Now, those are nearly not seen as assessment tools, but that's what they really are, because they will do this. Because a formal plan is one that includes those plus the smart objectives, or as Ms. Roberts was saying, the smarty objectives. Whatever way you want to do that, that's what happened. So my strong recommendation is to always is when you put something together, no matter what your funder asks you for, think about how you might assess this. Because the one thing that they all want to know, and of course you should want to know as well, I should say, is the outcomes of the work itself. And it's evidence-based outcomes, not just what we guessed or what we thought we saw and so forth. No, what is the information that you have that will feed you that? That's what you really should know. So to me, when do you start it? As soon as possible. So that means that you do a couple things. You clarify what your program and objectives and goals are going to be. You put your questions together. You put your methods in terms of your approach, how you want to do this. Remember, we said one of the things is approach, and then setting up a timeline for your activities. So clarifying your goals and objectives then. The first step in doing that is going back to saying, what do you want to accomplish? Ask yourself, what do you want to accomplish? And then how have you set out to accomplish them? That if you answer that question, the reviewers will be very happy, because you would have a clear picture of that. How do you do this? Go back to the beginning when we talked about clarifying your problem statement, clarifying what your challenges are, clarifying what it is that you think is the issue here that needs to be addressed. If you do that, and then you say, okay, how I'm going to then address that. That's what I'm saying when how do you accomplish that? Clarify and identify which are the major components of that. The simple part of that is what you can and can't do. Don't promise the kitchen sink. Don't say we're going to, change the world. No, that's not what you're going to do. What you're going to do is you're going to dress your little bit of stuff in your particularly part of the world. I could tell you that a major fault of a lot of programs in this area, or application source programs in this area, and reviewers pick this up all the time, is if you overpromise. Don't overpromise. There's nothing wrong with being conservative and saying what you're going to do. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't overpromise. Just promise what it is that you are confident that you and your partners can accomplish. And the way to do that is just put it together as a table of a program. Here's what the challenge, here's what the issue is, here's what we're going to try to accomplish, and work on that.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So I lost a grant one time, or I won't say lost. I was not awarded a grant one time because they said that my objectives were, my goals, of change in population wasn't high enough. And I was trying to do just that, not over promise. So my question is, do I ask them what level of change they're looking for, or level of what target goal they're looking for?
So what was it that you were focusing on?
This is when I was a teacher, so I was focusing on the grant was for a wellness program at the high school. And so the goal was, and I can't remember exactly, because before I asked the question, I was trying to remember exactly what it said, but I don't remember exactly. But generally, it was saying that we would have, and I can't even remember which target I had for lifestyle change and weight loss. I can't remember exactly. But knowing high school students and I didn't want to overpromise. And so I put in what I thought would be realistic. And so when I wasn't awarded and I called to find out what was the weakness, what caused them not to give it to me, that was the one thing she said, it wasn't high enough.
Understood. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting echo. Maybe if you could turn your mic off when I answer.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we can interface, but we'll have to do the mic off and on switching. I hope that's okay. All right. So there's a high probability when you get that type of response that you didn't provide a benchmark or a baseline to where you were starting. And that's one bit. The second is that a justification for why you were being not overpromising. You're explaining this. Remember what we said last week was you try to reduce the amount of questions they might have. When they see that you're too conservative, and there's three reasons here. So let me give you the two, and then I'll give you a third. The second thing is that when you look at what you have, you need to you need to be able to provide a reasonable rationale. You as a teacher had insights about your population that may or may not been conveyed in the grant application itself. Strong enough reason as to why you think, given that they're teens and given who you've worked with, how this done. And a lot of times how you justify that is both your insights, your valuable insights, and previous work that others have done to show how you've moved from your bench line, that. So that goes back to your bench line. The other part of it could be something, and I really, just be honest, I really would be misstating this if I didn't say this, and some of the reviewers on the phone, I'm sure on the call, could justify. A lot of times the reviewers themselves have their own expectation of what it is that you should have provided to them. And that have been conveyed in the FOA, RFA, or RFP, or from their own discussions and so forth. That really was something that came up during their discussion that you have no control over. And that happens less time than others, but it does happen. And they would, particularly if it's a highly competitive, they only have five they could fund, and there's 25 to 30 of y'all, and there's something that they're looking for, or they themselves are overly ambitious about what they want to accomplish, and realistically though, and that's most of the time based upon their own experience, their own information, whatever. So that's how I would look at that. And if I was a reviewer on that panel now brought up, then those are the kinds of questions that I would ask and get answered, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And so really, because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, to overpromise, I mean, I know you shouldn't, because that's gonna look bad in the evaluation monitoring.
Can I say it doesn't look bad? You're promising things you can't accomplish, and that looks bad if you try to go for more, or if you try to do the work itself.
Okay.
That hurts you maybe not in the short run, but in the long run. If that
Okay.
is,
Yeah, it does.
sorry
That's
to
what I
interrupt.
was thinking. I already have the money, but if you're pointing out, you're rightly pointing out that if I go for more money somewhere else, then they're gonna say, well, you couldn't accomplish this, so what makes me think you can accomplish that? So, okay, all right.
Right. But does those other explanations make sense when you go back and review what you sent them?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Very good question, ma'am. I appreciate it. Other questions as we are at this point? Okay. So in your application, be sure that when you're developing your monitoring and or evaluation question, that the question itself covers these 4 categories. Okay. And the planning and implementation issue, how are you falling in that? How are you assessing how are you going to attain what your objectives are? Remember the SMART objectives. What is the impact on participants? And I would just say, what are the outcomes as well as impacts? And then what is the outcomes impact on your community? In other words, those that not only just you're trying to serve your participants, but also those they are engaged with or they're involved. So, and then realistically, what is your timeline? If they're only going to fund you for a year, you really have to be very clear about what you could accomplish in a year. And the thing that I keep in mind is that for the most part, and this is not always the case, so I'm going to really, really hedge a bit on this. It is to your advantage to either before you get it or at the very beginning of when you get supported to allow time for startup. Right? Unless it's a continuation. If it's a continuation of something you're already doing, you're good to go. You still need a good startup though, because you're reevaluating and putting things together. But if it's a new effort, you need startup time. So you really do need to be paying attention to that and dart. And then your evaluation, everything else should begin at the beginning. But keep in mind that you need to allow yourself some room to get the project up and running. It's really a lot of times the things that we see in reviews is that say these are programs that have been running for 5 years. They are not for profits. One of the standards of not for profits, as you know, is staff turnover, right? Partner turnover. The community changes around you, the people you work change around you. Those changes, those are contextual issues. It's critically important that you take those into account when you put your timeline together and you're thinking about how you might want to do this and you're thinking about your evaluation. Consider things that you normally would take into account because you all know that starting a partnership, you have to get to know the partner if you don't already know them. They may be referred to you, but that doesn't mean automatically y'all are besties. What it means is that you need to take time to figure out how you might work together if not. We know all the time that we have in networking, it's not only just a skill, but it's an art. And it's fraught by relationships that do or do not work. And we all work in our networks to not burn bridges. And so compromise, finding middle ground, negotiation, all those things play a role. But it's not like you can do that like yesterday. It takes time to do this because negotiation for example, particularly principal negotiation, or you're both trying to make sure everyone walks away feeling good, takes time to get to know those folks and ever. So again, when you put your timeline together, allow yourself some room for startup. And startup can be defined as anything, but you really need to do that. And good reviewers, particularly if it's a challenging project, like the one that I've been using as the example, which is the asthma project in the two different areas, it's going to take a little bit of an effort, particularly if it's a new program, even if it's an ongoing program, because now you're applying for funds to keep going, but you've made adjustments in staff and partners, so forth. Those things need to be taken into account. And then your assessment questions and everything here that I have here needs to be addressed. So this is startup. When do you provide the reports to those things? When should the evaluation end? Those are the kinds of things you need to address. But I just want to say that generally the assessment will end when you yourself think the results are available and you're able to work. Now, so what is the main report here? When you're proposing how you're going to design and put your assessment together for your grant application, you need to be clear on these points. What is expected by your staff, by your stakeholders, by your partners, and so forth? What is the outcomes, that you want to see, that you expect of the key participants? And you could cover this in your objectives. However, your report also needs to cover that and need to talk about how you're going to narrate this to your funders. Not all funders are going to ask this, because not all ask this much detail, but just be prepared that you're going to do this. Because remember what we said last Friday, the not-for-profits have in general, a diverse portfolio of funders. And that means they come from everywhere. The idea is to be nimble and be able to pull your resources together, pull your partners together to address, if an opportunity presents itself, you should be ready to address those and respond to those independent of what the source might be. That's why I'm covering these information and giving you some general idea, because opportunities will come and go. Some of these, if you work in the arena most of us work in, will say, we need you to respond to this funding opportunity within the next month or 2 months. It's not like with the federal research grants that gives you longer period of time to do. Most of the stuff we apply for, the announcement will come out in March, and the application will be due in late May or early June. And that's about as much time as we got to do that, which for these things, a lot of times it's rushing it. However, if these are the kinds of things that you keep in mind and have in front of you, provide this, you'll be able to respond in a reasonably strong way. And then the answer is yes to the question that gets asked all the time. The stronger grants, do they get funded? Yes, they do. But there's a strategy behind that. And the strategy is that they usually have as their template the type of experienced persons, as I said earlier, as well as knowing what it is that most funders ask you to write on. So those are the things: experience, and then having a sense of what they're going to ask you, because that's what experience gives you. But at the same time, if you're new, if you have a sense of this and you put it together, you can. So templates for these sections, which is why I've given you told you put this and this, put this and that, and so forth, because those allows you to create templates where you fill in the blanks. So specific tools that you're going to use: technical reports, research papers, tools, information, quarterly reports, so on and so forth. Those things are excellent to give you some idea of how to put together and promise the kinds of information that you're going to give to the funder, because they're going to ask you to give them a quarterly report, a semi-annual report, an annual report. And if you're ready and you can say we're going to do that reasonably, you're in phenomenal shape. So just briefly, I don't know if we have a question before I go. Okay, so just briefly then, I'm going to go over the types of evaluation that you might want to look. So, and this has a lot to do with what your decision. So your decision on the type of evaluation and or monitoring you want is going to be based upon what it is you want to do. So if it's a short-term program, like it's only a year, then that's one type. If it's going to be multiple years, like a 3 or 4 year or 5 year effort, that's a different type. So the first type I'm talking about is for the latter, which is the 3, 4, 5 year type of thing, and it includes the planning part, implementation part, and then when you're going to move to the next phase. It's a higher probability that if you have a program with a lot of activities involved, you want to be able to go and continue and perpetuate this program. So putting in place a process or formative type of assessment includes monitoring, which is where you start off with and provide that is what you want. So that's what this would be here. That this is the type of effort you have. Now, if it's a short-term program or short-term effort, and you need immediate type of feedback, then you're going to look at more of outcomes. So you're just looking at what is the results of the program, and you're going to pay attention to the bigger picture. It's not ongoing. The grant's going to end, and it's a short time. So outcome is you're going to need. And so it's just want to look at goals and objectives, collect the small data on that. If you have a long-term program, like for example, a end of period reports, and end of period reports are generally a period is generally a 3 to 5 year type of thing. Impact assessment is what you want. It's very different than what we term in terms of outcome, and very different than process, because really what you're trying to get at is what has happened to the program and those participating in it cumulatively all together over this last 5 years. What are the bigger kind of difference we've made? You know, you may, for example, you may see this when persons are doing applying for an assessment related to, say, financial impact or monetary impact or some kind of economic impact that your efforts or your program has made on the bigger community. And that's not generally something that you measure in a year, even though you see people do that. It's really not true. What you want to be able to look at is over time, how over time. And so an impact evaluation helps you to do that. Now, so that you know what you would have. So that in general, an evaluation, as I said, monitoring allows you just to see and answer the question, is the program working the way it should? Evaluation helps you to know whether or not the intervention, whatever it might be, like for example, with the asthma program, did the intervention, which is providing services, accessible services to young persons, help to show a reduction in morbidity mortality for this population that had previously been high. So as we use this example from last week, remember you're applying for a grant for an intervention to reduce morbidity mortality among young persons with asthma in both the urban area and a rural area. And the goal of there is to show a reduction. So your outcome is going to be going from a base, a base of high, which is maybe 50%, to a low over 5 years to 30% rate of morbidity mortality. And so that's your intervention. And then you have your goals and your aims of that intervention. You have your objectives, and then you have your components to your plan. How you're going to measure manage and measure. What are you going to do in terms of the programs, the steps that work? What are the indicators, the things you said that you want to do? What are your targets? For example, going from 50% down to 30%. How are you going to measure that via program information, via questionnaire, via interviews, qualitative, quantitative, and so forth. And then what expected change, your outcomes. What do you expect to see? What is your outcomes going to be? So this is the anatomy of an evaluation. There's a whole lot more to this, but I at least want to give you an idea of what you might want to put into an application. So as I said, this book, it's on Amazon actually, and very cheap, by the way, and it's an oldie but a goodie. And I even use this, as I mentioned last time, in my advanced evaluation methods class, even though it's a very simple book. And the main reason is because it is one of the few books, and we hope to replicate this someday, which is literally walks you through step by step on how to do an evaluation. So it's aptly titled Evaluator's Handbook, Sage publication, still active. I would recommend it to you. All right, so that is a brief overview. I know it was quick, a lot of information, but at least I wanted to give you a little bit of the type of things you need to consider for that. Now, the reality is that for me, some of you, writing the evaluation section of your grant application may not be something that you do, which is fine. But I at least wanted you to understand what should go there. It's, to me, one of the best ways is someone who does professional evaluation on a regular basis. One of the best folks to work with are those that at least are facile or have a decent understanding of the language. They knows what a goal is, an aim is, an objective is, how to put things together, and so forth. So we want to do that. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and see if we have a comment, question. Roberts, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Dr. Telfer, I really appreciated what you said about estimating the startup time. And I think one of the things I found over time is that some granting agencies approve the grant, but don't get you the money on time. And yet they then sometimes want to hold you to your estimates of outcomes. And in small organizations where you maybe need to expend money to hire somebody, you have to wait for the money to come in. So I think one of the things that I've learned is to put in the grant application, the timing would be contingent on the receipt of funds instead of what may be a start date when you don't have the funds.
That's an excellent suggestion. And that's something that you learn via working with your partners. But that's what the startup time would be, and that's an estimated startup time. So yeah, excellent suggestion. Okay, other comment. Thank you, ma'am. The other Roberts, Ma'am. Miss Suzanne Roberts.
Other Roberts.
Yes.
So I think one of the things that I've seen reoccurring in grants, and this speaks to the evaluation piece, is grantors are wanting to see what's replicable. So we want to, like a grant that a couple of partners on the call are working on right now is addressing the prevention of adverse childhood experiences and building a trauma responsive community. And part of what they're wanting to do, because this is such a new area, is they're wanting to understand, is what we're doing working, and could it be replicated in a different part of the state, for instance. So I think that's another way to sort of look at the why around the importance of evaluation, because we want to make sure that we're reaching the number of people that we need to reach, that that the work we're doing is having an impact on the intention of the grant. So that's a very simplistic way for me to always grasp the why.
Yes. No, I understand. And that's the thing. It's like, it's not, the idea behind it is, I appreciate tremendously what you're saying, which is why we who are evaluators always say, think about the assessment beforehand, and to answer the question of why to do it. It's not there, just to have. It's there. And also, one of the things is, and I think both Roberts, it's important that you, if even if you're not asked to put something together to assess what your work is, do it anyway. Think about it anyway, because eventually funders are going to ask you for it. They themselves may not ask you for it off the bat, but they will eventually ask you for it. And either them or your partners or your participants will ask you for proof or evidence. And The other big piece, and this is as someone who's been in this doing this for a really long time, at some point, if you provide services and the service you're providing keeps expanding, you want to really answer your basic question: all this work that we're doing, is it really making a difference that we want? And if you don't have an assessment thing in place, it's all guesswork. If it's working or not, it's, you guessing, your clients are guessing, your partners are guessing, and that's really not quality to help you in the long run. So anyway, just a suggestion. Yes, Miss Conley.
Yes, this question is for Miss Lizanne. When you talked about being able to replicate it, is that something that you actually write into the grant? Like, we would love to be able to replicate this. Do you go in with that as a goal, and do you put that in the grant as a goal?
If the grant asks for it, you can.
Okay.
But sometimes grantors are looking for models that then can be replicated in other areas.
Okay.
And they're looking, and that other part is that lends to the collaboration between, that could lend to collaboration between communities.
Okay.
Because when we're addressing, if we're addressing adverse childhood experiences, or we're addressing being trauma responsive, or whatever that nutshell might be, about what the grant's about, quite often they're looking for communities to learn from each other too.
Gotcha.
So
So,
is it, oh,
Go ahead, ma'am.
Go ahead, Rhonda.
Yeah.
so you know this because they say it specifically in the paperwork. Are they saying this specifically in the paperwork?
Quite often that's an overarching piece of what they're about. So that kind of goes back to the beginning of our discussions on the first day, when Dr. Telfair said, read their mission and vision and what the organization cares about. Because that's like the umbrella part for me when I'm thinking about, if we're going to go after this funding, what does this organization really care deeply about? And if it's preventing adverse childhood experiences, or addressing trauma in a responsive way, then what does that look like locally, and what are our local assets that may be, like, I'm getting ready to write another part of this grant. I'm like thinking about, do we really have a good map of the assets in our community that address adverse childhood experiences and being trauma responsive? So that's a question that I'm in for myself about, that I could write into the evaluation part of the grant. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
what would you say about that, Dr. Telfair?
Okay, so I would say, so going back to, these are great questions, by the way. So Ms. Conley, and also you, Ms. Barlow, a couple of things here. If you go back to the first set of slides, the two things that we talked about, one was innovation. And remember what we said: innovation in and of itself is not just simply a new or great idea. It's an impactful idea. It is one that's going to make a difference. It's one that people are expecting. So when they ask you to do that, all of them have that. And the second thing that we talked about was and I agree with Ms. Roberts. The expectations of an agency or funder is usually written into the reasons why. The RFA, RFP, FOAs will tell you the purpose of this. They will all of them will say this: the purpose of this RFA, FOA, RFP is this. And so they will tell you that right off the bat. So it's right there written in plain language. The other part of it is, though, is what we said before, is if you can, look at what they funded before. Talk to people who have they funded before and see what theirs are, because some of these are just things that they go over. Now, the other piece that I would say, if we are lucky, and it's not always the case, but if we are lucky, some of these RFA, FOAs, RFPs have a tell you in the back, here's how we're going to assess you. They will say the review criteria for this particular announcement is this. And literally in there, you will see what they're looking for. And 9 times out of 10, they're looking for what Ms. Roberts says, which is that the dual, or you, can this be done? And can we learn from this? Remember, I said lessons learned is not just for you, but for your funders as well. So I agree with Ms. Roberts on those bits. And a lot of times it's explicit, so other times it's not. But just like I said, margin evaluation may not be explicit, but expect it. It's there. Now, the third part of the part I would add is many times we are in an area where information or these types of efforts are not novel. There's a clear chance that others have done all or part of what we're trying to do. And the good thing about being replicable is demonstrating how you also can use what it is that you've learned that others have done or even yourself have done. For example, Ms. Barlow, a teacher, there are some unique ways that you've been able to communicate and deal with the students in the classroom that you want to either modify, replicate, or support, and you want to put that in your grant application. So your ability to craft that and to demonstrate that, to show how this can be done, is promising. That's part of what innovation is it's promising. It's saying that coming up with this idea and then they could learn from it and how it can be used. So that would add to what Ms. Roberts is saying and try to answer both what you and Ms. Connolly are saying, that it's not always going to be asked up front, but at the same time you should expect that. And I think the other Ms. Roberts was probably trying to say something. I'm sorry.
I was just saying that it even if it's not asked for, it's something that you may want to allude to, not promise, but allude to, just in case the funder hasn't thought about it themselves.
Yep. Agreed. Okay. Other questions while we paused? Okay. All right. So the latter part of the slides you have in front of you is concluding the grant proposal. So we've talked about all the other components, including the assessment in the works. And I appreciate the comments from the colleagues on the phone or the call, and appreciate the questions because they're really, really good questions. All right, then. So let's get into that. So into the application content, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So generally, this is where you put your table and figures. This is where your budget is laid out. This is where your letters of support are there. And I have a comment on that, by the way. We'll get to it. And your appendices, are there as well. So the project design and methods. So the part of that you're going to have in terms of logistics falls under the end of your project. So in the end of your project, you're going to talk about your project setting. You should have a description of your setting or your place where you're going to plan to do the work. And this concludes not just your setting, but if you have partners, which most of you do, a description of their setting as well. So in your description of where the work's going to be done, it should be that. The other part is where physically the work's going to take place. So in our example of the two, one rural area, one urban area, you should have a description, brief as it was. So example, if it's in Chatham, then a descriptor of Chatham that just lays it out, how it works, that sort of thing. It doesn't need to be super elaborate, but just enough. If your partner county is Bryan, then you're going to talk about Bryan, which is a much smaller county, but more rural. You can talk about that. So those things need to be there as well. So not just the physical workplace, your agency or your partner's agency, but the environment, the physical environment in which the work's going to take place. And then another good thing to put in the project setting description is history. Is this a place that in the past has been able to use for the kind of work you're doing, or future will be able to use? For example, if it's changed, if there's a new thing that might strengthen this. So now there is this new metro system that just got put up and running that goes out to this rural county that didn't go before, that we can take advantage of in our project, so on and so forth. So those kind of innovative tweakings there. Personnel, we talked about this last week, but and I was when I indicated I was come back to this. I cannot emphasize how critically important it is that you communicate to your funder the qualifications of those that are going to be working on the project, as well as their duties and responsibilities. Those all things need to be crystal, not guessing what they're going to do, but very, very clear. And that needs to line up with their experience, their credentialing, if you have them, the work that they've done, and so forth. All of these things need to be there because it'd be here. Some of this is more important than others. So, for example, a lot of not-for-profits are applying to the same funder. And so the funder may be very familiar with them via their project officer or others, and they know the personnel. They could speak to your agency and so forth. That is to your advantage. That is building a relationship with the same funder over time. If a lot of times you should that is good, but don't rely on it, because just like your agency personnel changes, funder agency personnel changes. And it's happened to, I can't tell you how many times it had happened to us, where we had developed really good work relationships with people who were funders, and then they leave, or something happens with them, particularly government related funders. So keep that in mind. But personnel should be very clear of who they are, what duties and responsibility are, and what qualifies them best to do the work. And that latter part, why are they best qualified to do the work, is going to be part of your justification. And you could actually, I know it may sound trivial, but I have seen reviewers, low score an application that in all the other aspects were pretty good, because they did not believe that the person who's going to carry the work out were adequately qualified to do the work. And I cannot emphasize that to you more. As I said, personnel is way more important than a lot of us give it credit for, because there are people that do this. Because remember, of all the questions that you need to answer in a grant application, there are a couple ones that are very big and and can sway reviewers, and personnel is one of them. If they are not convinced that of this, they are going to not score you well enough. So please keep that in mind. It should be number 12 on this, so forgive my mislabeling. But anyway, the project sequence or time plan, which we just went over, the work plan itself, if it's a proposal, like, for example, a government agency like HRSA or SAMHSA, one of the other agencies, or the state, Georgia state, will ask you for a work plan that lays things out. And I'll give you an example of a timeline on how to put it together. The point of it is, it needs to be a logical sequence, and I agree with the Miss Shirley Roberts, that you need to really give yourself a little wiggle room at the beginning. You also need to be, well, as I have sort of preached being conservative across putting grants together, this is one of the places where you should give yourself a lot of room, because the reality is that you are working with human beings and in situations that you do not control in a laboratory. So that means that stuff happens. And if you don't account for stuff happening, then it's not going to, then you're going to find yourself out of sequence. And if you find yourself out of sequence, you're going to find yourself in trouble with the time and phrasing of your application. So my strong recommendation is to give yourself a lot of wiggle room, as much as you possibly can. That's realistic given the time frame of when you're being funded. And I'll show you an example coming up. And then who is going to be involved in your project, descriptors, be they adolescents with asthma, be they come from certain geographic, racial ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, gender groups, so on and so forth. Who is the target population and who they're involved, and that should logically fit with who the problem is. You should have stated this in the very beginning of these things, but clearly where you ask for the sample in your methods may really be there. So this is a very abbreviated version of a timeline. I am a big proponent of using Gantt charts to show your timeline. And the main reason is, and other reviewers, persons who reviewed on the phone could speak to this, is that it lays it out very well. It gives you a clear visual of what stuff is going on. And this is just one taken from a project that we have on these things. And if you look at the very beginning in terms of development and refinement, this is how I break things up. I usually use it phases and tasks. And our first phase of our project is titled development and refinement. So that's the wiggle room period. That first quarter is our startup. And you can see all the stuff we have listed to do in startup, meeting with our groups, meeting with our partners, staff hiring and training, coordination, logistics, and so forth. And so we're all doing that in the first quarter. So whatever the first couple of months we have, we're going to do this. And this is a year and a quarter project of a 5-year project. And that gives us plenty of room to do a lot of the other work that we have. So my strong recommendation is to visualize what you have and then put it into something where others could look at this and as one of my person who used to judge my work all the time would say, the chart should speak for itself. And it really should. If in the olden days, before maybe internet, we used to review grants and they would all be paper grants. So, and we used to go to some place in a big room and we'd have literally stacks of these things. So the thing is though, if you and they'd be clipped together, and I know I'm sort of speaking to people who've been around a while, this, but they used to be clipped together. And I can tell you, at least one of these meetings, someone would have one of these things and they'd be unclipped and they'd trip and fall. And then the paper would fly everywhere. And so a lot of times, and then of course, if it's one of those grants where it's not page not bringing things, you could just see the description. The idea is then that you could pick it up and that these sections will speak for themselves. And we learned the hard way on this. And I could tell you though, too, that in the electronic version of these things, bringing us back to, modern time, a lot of times, single paging or multiple paging these time things, because they don't give you a lot of room to put this together, is excellent. So anyway, point of it is, if you could draw it and visualize it, there's a high probability that those looking at it can look at it itself. So I recommend that. So tables and figures that are going to be in your appendices or other places. Well-designed tables and figures should be something that, clear. So if it's like a data table or a personnel table or a picture of an area, particularly if you're going to do, a grant of a facility or an area, for example, if it's a poverty program and you're trying to demonstrate the geography of the area itself, or you have it as an asset map, which is what Ms. Other Roberts was talking about. There's things called deficit maps and asset maps where they kind of show you a neighborhood and then show you the areas where there's like churches and community centers and other kinds of things. Those are other areas on this one. The other part is that, keep in mind, tables and figures should speak for themselves. So if there are discrepancies between what it is that you have in terms of how you're describing something and what the table shows, reviewers will see that right off the bat and bring that up. So that's why I say all tables and figures, it's just necessary that, if you have information, that you provide that, particularly if you're trying to do a baseline, which is what I was speaking about earlier. It's really good to have that. Some RFAs, FOAs, RFPs ask you for this, particularly if it's a federal grant or state application or a large funding agency. They will ask you to provide them with these tables. And also, it's a really good idea, by the way, if you want to make clear the characteristics of the population you're working with, to create this demographic tables and things that you might have. Always a good idea. And also make sure that while the data parts of the table is clear, a brief legend, how to write, at the bottom. You've seen these tables where they showed you charts and graphs, like for example, with the COVID situation. Those are all kind of were there, but they always have this little tiny narrative at the bottom that really gives you a brief overview. Always good to have, and particularly when you're putting these things for the grants. So those are tables and figures. Now the budget. So things about the budget that I think is very important. Before you sit down and think through the budget, the part you need to keep in mind is that most of what you're applying to will tell you how much money that they have available for you to work with. However, there are going to be funders that have a range, and that range will be from a minimum to a maximum. And it's your decision, you and your team's decision of how much it is that you want to go. Yeah, I mean, for some, it's a given that you're going to go for the max. There's no question. I mean, most of the time, that's what you're going to do. But it's a strategy. You know, do you or don't you do this? This is where we make the recommendation to understand the funder well, because, for example, you may say it's a $100,000 grant, and that is what you budgeted for to the penny, which I know many of you are really, really good at doing that, to the penny. However, the funder may say, initially, we're going to fund 30 of these because we have a couple, 100,000, a couple million to this. And then they decide, we're going to add about 5, 6 more to this, which happens all the time. That means that they're going to cut 10 to 15% of what you asked for out of your budget. So that's where the strategy part comes in. When you apply for funding, particularly from other funders, it's phenomenal if you can get everything that you asked for, but you all know, you've been in this a long time, there's a good chance you may not, 50-50. So I would say hedge it. I would say be very parsimonious in your application, and when you apply for things, yes, go for what you think you're going to get, but just be prepared that if you're asked to cut, you're going to be prepared to do that. Now, the thing about cutting is what the other Miss Roberts said, that they will still expect whatever you promise you were going to do, you're going to do, and even if they cut you. Now, they may not negotiate that with you, but you should be prepared if that happens. So that's why I said match the proposal or match what you expect it to do. The other side of that is they may not give you, as I said before, most of the time, the amount of money offered is not enough to do what it is you want to do. So also prepare for that. And it's that kind of juggling act that you keep in mind. That's why I brought this up at the very beginning when we talk about budgets. So budgets, it should be unambiguous about the information. And what I mean by that is that it frustrates to no end reviewers when you have something in your budget, a line of justification, that is just not really clear why it's there. Right. So if you're going to say we're going to ask money to support a mobile van that goes into our rural area to help and provide the services, and you have some other item that's on the van that doesn't make sense in terms of how it's related to provision of services, like some piece of equipment or some other luxury thing, that there's no justification for why you have that or do this. Like, it may be perfectly reasonable that you would put a laptop with a VCR connection in the mobile van, because you need to use it for like education services or something. But if you don't explain that's why it's there, then the reviewer is not going to just think it's a luxury item and not something that's necessary for what it is you're trying to do. You may think, that it's there for education, because we all know part of providing good services to young persons with chronic disease is that you really do need to have some educational type of things to provide them, videos and handouts and things like that. So keep that in mind. Also keep clear that the cost of the funding, by source, is, as I said, not be met. items on your budget need to be itemized to determine the cost itself. And it needs to be a clear and reasonable justification. So what happens in the funding is that funders are themselves pull out their mechanism to assess, your costs. They're going to check the numbers behind you. Now, what happens a lot, and this is a part of craft, things that you may or may not know. Up front, the line reviewers are going to, all their ask is to say whether the budget looks reasonable to them or not. That's their job. They're not asked to check the numbers behind you. But the funder has another group that literally does that. That their job is the accounting is just to go and check your numbers and check your figures and check your work. So know that the initial reviewers is just, they may agree and think it's reasonable, but doesn't mean that the funders think so. So that's then where they make if it's recommended to fund it, that's where they make cuts or adjustments or whatever. So be very, very clear about how you put the budget together. Now, budgetification itself is clearer. So you will have the line item budget, which is the cost and the numbers and that, and then you have the personnel. And the percent time, percent effort, those sort of things need to be laid out. And it needs to line up with this second bullet, which is what people will do. It has to be reasonable. It has to be reasonable. The rule of thumb is that if a person is going to get paid or asked to put a certain percent effort in a grant or proposal, the cost itself should line up reasonably with they were expected to do. If they're only there to give advice, and you have them in for 15% time on a project that's on that, reviewers may not agree with that. Reviewers may not see that 50% time for someone whose only job is to give you advice is good. However, if they have concrete tasks that they're going to carry out and so forth, it's in that sort of thing. Now, you could underestimate. That's your call, But if you have to really do that, so again, if it's reasonable and it lines up well with what it is, that should be there. So how much each person will cost needs to be there. Fringe and salary needs to be there, and so forth. Now, the rationale for any consultant on the project needs to be reasonable. Generally, these are just they're usually not your line items in terms of your personnel budget. They're usually a fee for service or straight up cost. That is your call, and that is your decision. As long as the project officer and the people who agree with that. But in the budget, I would remind you that if you're going to use a consultant, the budget and budget justification is not the first place to put this person, right? You should have said something about them in the personnel, and you should have said something about them way back in the method section as well. Because you got to justify them in multiple places, and then the budget is not the place to justify them. I know that happens all the time, which is why I'm bringing it up. They should not be the thing. So if you're going to be used, then mention the inclusion of these persons in the procedures in the method section. This is the thing. So keep this in mind. I have a consultant. The consultant itself is going to help us, but we need to be talking about how this person is going to help us throughout the rest of what we've already said. So that is not a good sign. Travel, how many laugh? Because I kept it in despite we're in the COVID situation, because you still need to know that when God willing, we are all out of COVID, we get to travel. Trust me, I'm jonesing for travel too, so I get it. But the reality is that you should justify travel, and there are going to be justifications based on the type of work you do. We work in the state, in the city, and that sort of thing. So the easiest thing for reviewers is that if you justify travel based on existing policies from your state or your government or whatever it is you're doing, and then other costs, such as telephone, computer, that sort of thing, if it's allowable to use that, because it may not be. Some grants itself, these are not allowable. We have a grant now, it's a huge grant, but they don't allow indirect costs or these kind of things on it. So just be aware that those are the case. And then the other points to consider Itemized budgets should be finalized after all key decisions about the operations are made. So don't do what a lot of people do. They see a $100,000, we're going to give you this, and they start writing a budget right away. No, no. Write your proposal, then decide on what the budget. You could do a preliminary of the budget, like an outline of it, but don't finalize it until you finalize what your proposal is going to look like. All right. Meaning that's a mistake, because that people will see that. That's where the mistakes about either underestimating or overestimating or not justifying adequately, all those kinds of things that you get tagged for in the budget happens if you put the budget together before you actually put the proposal together. And I know that sounds simplistic, but think about it. That happens more often than you think. And so the funder does reserve the right to adjust your budget. As I said in big bold letters, plan on it. Just don't assume if it's for $100,000, you're going to get $100,000. If you do, God bless you. That's fantastic. But a lot of times, particularly if it's philanthropic funders, if it's not-for-profit funders, or if it's federal government agencies, they will adjust your budget based upon what's available to them. I think it was mentioned earlier that you adjust that, but they will say that if you read the fine print, many of them will tell you that that here's what we hope to give people, but based on available funds, that's how we're going to fund you. So there's a diversity of reasons that happen, and trust me, I have been on projects where we were funded for 5 years, and because there were changes in the agency of one type or another, we were asked to cut our 5 years to 2.5 years and close out before we were actually finished. So it happens all kinds of ways: up front, long run. Just be prepared. So here's the thing about letters of support. So while not-for-profits are accustomed to getting letters of support from other people, I would just say there's letters of ways that your project and the effort you're doing can be endorsed. There is the general way, or the handshake way, but then there is sort of the way on steroids, or the mega way. My recommendation is always to use the mega way, and that is having an MOU, which is stronger and recommended. And here's what I mean. An MOU, which is a Memorandum of Understanding, literally lays out who's going to do what, how, what, and when. And if a viewer sees that, they're really clear of that, because the person can write you a letter of support as an agency or program, but they don't really have a real commitment to that. There's no skin in the game. What reviewers want to see is, do you really, the strength of the relationship going forward between you and the persons that support you, right? And so if you have an agency or another effort, it's best to write a memorandum of understanding. And you could always have letters of support, like from a government agency, a government person, or whatever. That's good. But if you're going to be working with people, MOUs is what you should be doing. And then view the project as making the most important and how you're going to pull those things together. And so appendices, the rule of thumb is only to include tables, charts, graphs, and lists like that. Don't try to pad the application with additional information in order to think that reviewers are going to use that. The only times I could tell you, and others who are reviewers could tell you, we look at appendices when they're relevant to what it is we're trying to ask a question about. Additional stuff in there, unless it's asked for, don't include it. And so as a rule of thumb, I would just suggest only includes table, charts, graphs, and any kind of list that you think is relevant to what it is that goes in the body of the text. And some RFAs, FOAs, RFPs, particularly electronic ones, will limit the amount of pages they give you. So they're limiting the amount of appendices you can actually have. Otherwise, think about this, at the end of the proposal, appendices should be clearly marked in references, as you know, and particularly true if you're expanding and providing that information on your target population, letter support, MOUs, resumes, and key personnel. And if you look at that list, particularly this list here, that's a lot of information. And if you pay on a page limit, then you be really careful. Some CVs or resumes are only limited to either a single page or 2 pages, and writing those parts. So just be aware that that's the case. And additional points, I have a couple, and these are just stuff to remember to do that we forget all the time. If you be sure to check your deadlines, receipt dates versus postmark dates. And this is particularly true if because these days most of the things you're sending are going to be, with rare exceptions these days, electronic. And so, don't wait on the day that a proposal is due to electronically submit your proposal, because whether you plan for it or not, the system itself is a risky business, because if everybody submits on the day it's due, there's a really good chance that you will have some kind of electronic mishap. I don't know about most of you, but this happens more often than not. So my recommendation is always the day before, if you can. And then if you can't, and it's absolutely that, then do that. But pay attention to when things are due, and then when things need to be postmarked. Because it may give you something, may be postmarked, allows you to give you a little wiggle room and not. But most of the time, do that. Proofread, I put those in bold letters, your proposal. So and check for basic stuff, flow of the text, grammars, typos, spelling, pagination, and so forth. This may seem not that, but I can tell you, reviewers are anything that if they generally have anywhere between 5 to 10 proposals they got to review, and if they're reading something and there are grammar errors or typos or misspellings or all kinds of stuff, trust me, that's a formula for them not looking favorably on your proposal. It may seem trivial, but it's not. These things are the kinds of things that you do that. And they would propose questions. Unless you have a just outstanding prestige proposal, that has these things in it, you're good to go. But most of the time you want to check that. And acronyms. The rule of thumb, as you all know about acronyms, is that if you're going to use an acronym, the first time you use it, and every couple times after that, you spell it out so that people know what you're talking about. And then any explain or undefined jargon. You may be familiar with these things, but use this as an opportunity to educate your reviewers, and be realistic in planning in terms of development, into account the constraints such as personnel, existing sources. And briefly, what I mean by this is that you have a proposal. You have 3 partners that are critical to the proposal. How well do you know how they pay attention to time? Are they people that are timely? Or are they people that may or may not be those that pay a lot of attention to time? They're kind of the close to last minute type of folks. Or are there challenges that they have in terms of working together? Is life going on? Is life things happening? So forth. Pay attention to that and leave wiggle room in your application for that. Be accurate and honestly about the capabilities of your staff and your project partners. Don't again overpromise what someone's capability is, because you're going to be held to that account, and either in your first application or in subsequent. And then make sure that everybody's stuff is up to date, in terms of resume, staff person, things like that. And then allow time, you will need it. Proposals not funded. Let me just say this. I want to end with this. If it's not funded, then I would do what we talked about earlier, which is consider what the review panel said and the comments and why they said, and then seriously take a moment and think about why is that the case. These days, if you apply for a lot of the federal grants, particularly research grants, the funding rate for those things these days is below 15%. So that means that 85% of applications do not get funded, no matter how good they are. And for places where there's a high number of submissions, particularly the type of work that we do in not-for-profit arena, expect that you may not get funded. It doesn't mean that you should not try again. Just know that the first time around may not be. And unless you're someone they know or trust, I mean, there's all kinds of factors and reasons why people will do that. But don't take that as a bad sign. Try to learn from it and improve on this one, particularly if it's an opportunity that you're passionate about and that you think you could do. And so I have in the proposal itself, and these are just sources of funding. So I'm going to stop there because the rest of it you have are just sources of funding, other places you could go on this one. And I'm going to stop on this part. These are all sources that you should look at. And all of these locally as well as nationally have that. And then grant writing, these are all reasonably priced grant, these two things here. And then of course there is for government grants like Health and Human Services, they have both where you can go to get these, and also there's some really good grant writing tips on these things. And then the rest of it is also all online. These are all online that you can have, and you can click these. You should be able to click these. These are all up to date. The community toolbox is one of my favorite go-tos, and then the rest of these are just other recommendations. And of course, you got one today about United Way. So I would put those together. All right. So I think we're at our question and answer page right now. So we have a little bit of time for that. I'm going to pause before we go to our next thing, but question and answer.
Dr. Telfair, I had a comment about the budget section. One thing that I don't think reviewers ask for, but I think it's a good reality check, is to take your final budget and divide it by, your clients served, to come up with a cost per client, just kind of as another check. There's I don't think there's guidance on that, but if your budget is 100,000 and you're only going to be reaching, for example, 50 clients, that's $2,000 per client. And is that a reasonable investment, or should you go back and evaluate?
Well, I mean, it depends on what the funder agency is at, right? I mean, that's one way to do the budget. And remember, what you need to provide to the funder is a justification for your budget item. So if that is how you yourself are lining that up, if you're going to do that average, I would suggest two things. First of all, a history of that how you've done that before. You've done it before and they funded you before, and then a descriptor of what that 2,000 covers for that particular item. So in other words, then your sample client is worth $2,000, and here's what that $2,000 covered. So those two things. There's probably a couple other things, but right off the as a reviewer, that's what I'd be looking for if you decide to do it that way. But that's your call in terms of how you structure it. And also, I would just say again, like you said, does the funder allow that? Is the funder have a good understanding of that? Is that okay with the way that they've looked at things in the past? So keep that in mind. Yeah. Other questions for people on the phone, on the call?
I just wanted to mention, just from my learning and perspective, is that sometimes the budget is also dictated by the number of people who live in the community. So that's one of the reasons the census is so important, because it does determine the amount of funding that comes into the community. So sometimes that's why we receive less money than another community, because of our population.
Well, Ms. Roberts, that is one of the examples of how the funding is linked. The funders would understand how that's linked together. Okay. Other questions of anything we've covered either on last Friday or today? Or any comments? I'm appreciating the comments. Okay, so seeing none, then let me just take a moment to review what's going to happen after we take our break. So a couple of things. So first of all, let me review the practice and exercise components. The breakout leaders will have you pull up the whole presentation. Your role as a participant, is to um, you can do this however way you want to do this in a breakout group, but to bring up or pull up either an RFA, RFP, FOA that you're considering and want to go after, and or a project that you're actually have in progress, an application you have in progress, and to use the information from the presentation as best you see fit to look at those or review those. And so that is where that's going to go with the presentation. The other part of that work that we're trying to have you do then is to answer try to ask questions of each other to see what works with you and what doesn't work with you, or issues that you have outstanding wise that you want to make sure that you cover with the work itself. So that's what's going to happen when you come back from the break. In the interim, for the break, Miss Ando is going to put in the chat for you the two assessments. We have an assessment in terms of an evaluation of the day one. If you haven't completed it, it'll be in the chat. The link for that's there, and then the link for today will also be there. And for both the CGIC and ourselves, we would love to hear your feedback on this, and we appreciate that. And they're really easy. They're no more than, it takes you more than 3 minutes a piece to do, but we'll do that. And okay, so let me.
Can I just
Of
interject?
course.
Rachel, did you get that? To
Yes,
put the
ma'am.
evaluations? Okay, got it. Just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. And one was going to ask before we break if you could. So it's 11:18 now. What time shall we come back?
Okay. Well, I was going to take a moment to go over the appendix thing, as I promised, quickly.
Okay,
since we did that. No, not a problem. Since you want to do this, so if you could see the screen here. Okay. Hopefully you can see the screen. All right, so in the appendix, the very last part, I added these monitoring, evaluation, and process data tools that I mentioned before. So here is the format we've used. So a lot of times, it's for monitoring your project. This is a form that we created based upon the work that we have done historically with not-for-profits over time, and worked with this.
Dr. Telson, I don't see what you're presenting.
Oh, you don't?
I was going to apologize. I just see you. I didn't see the screen. I'm sorry.
Okay, not a problem. Let me try again. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That happens a lot of times when I go in and go out. Okay. All right. So let me try again. Let me start over. Okay, so what you have is that we have worked on this and pulled this together as a really straightforward way for you to do for monitoring. So this project tracking matrix, or PTM goes with if you decide you're going to just monitor your program. And these are the components of what you put together for the monitoring. So, and this is something that you would put together and develop, and you can literally plug this into your grant application. So you have program contact personnel there. You have a data contact personnel, if there is such a person, say it's a Miss Lizanne Roberts or so. You have an evaluation personnel. So you may or may not have one, but just in case, it could all be the same person. Then what your project is about. So your goals that you have for the program would go here. The overall goals of your program, they could be one or more. I'm sorry. your objectives for your program corresponding to each goal. This is where we give you instructions on what to go here. The task, what's going to accomplish, and that's usually linked to each objective, and each objective is linked to each goal. And then the outcomes, what you expect, what you should be able to cover based on what you said if it's a SMART objective. So that what you expect to cover, and that's short-term, long-term outcomes, and eventually impacts. And then what it is you're going to measure, your indicators, as we talked about earlier. What is it that you're going to measure? How you're going to measure it? And then at the end of the effort, your final outcome, and then where you're going to get your information from. So just for tracking purposes, this is the information you need. And it's pretty straightforward. You have these, and as you are in your work breakouts, you can be thinking about this. But I wanted to show you this. It's pretty straightforward to do. Now, the other part is going, if you decide you want to evaluate the program. And so that's a little bit more complicated. So the comprehensive document itself lists the kinds of things you're going to achieve. So this is what, if you're just going to track or monitor, that's what it's going to look like. But these are the other pieces that you're going to need for the evaluation, which means that you're going to need something a little bit bigger. So here is an example of this, and I had this as a thought, but you guys don't have to do this, but this is just as a thought. This is something that we did when we were evaluating Healthy Start. And I know many of you know what Healthy Start is, and this is a Healthy Start. And this is just one benchmark from Healthy Start. And what the activity is, something that's going to be linked to the cluster indicator for Healthy Start. So just like you had your objectives, which you pull from achievement, your task, then you plug in your timeline in terms of how much time it's going to take to get this done. You keep your objective, your outcomes, your indicators here. So the goal will be here instead of as a column, and starts with objectives, and then your measures, your outcomes, and then formula to measure success. How will you know that your numerator, denominator, if it's qualitative, what it is you're going to have consensus on, and so forth. And then your achievement score, and that's going to be either based on something like a numerator denominator fraction, and or what your qualitative task is going to be, and then you have where your data is going to come from here. So these are just tools that I put there for you to use. I can explain these another time as you see fit, but this is something that when we put together monitoring and evaluation for most programs, we kind of break them into these components and there. So if you want to discuss or have a question about these, please feel free. We can always talk about this later. But I just want to show this, Ms. Roberts, before we went to the break, so I'll have something to consider. Any comments or questions on this? I know it's a lot, so we'll come back to it. Okay, all right. So we have the break. The normal time, I think the break was about 15 minutes. So we probably could do 15 minutes still and come back. And probably end up leaving a little earlier if possible. So 11:40, I guess, would be the time. Ms. Roberts, is that okay? Okay.
Yes. And if we could, if Blake and the other Roberts and Nicole could stay on for just a moment, just so that we can, if you could unmute we just want to make sure everybody understands before we go to our breakout sessions, what the next part is. You get everybody good?
Okay. All right. So we excusing everyone else, and then
I'm
we'll
sorry.
do that.
I have a quick question about the survey because I actually received a survey by email and completed it. So
Okay.
the one that's currently in the chat, is that for today or for last week?
Last week, ma'am.
Okay, I already completed it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for doing that. But we will get another one for today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Shirley and Blake, you're good, and Nicole, you're good. Okay. Just wanted to make sure we were, and for everyone else, we're going to come back here and then move to the breakouts. Okay, see you in 15. Thank you, Dr. Telfair.
Not a problem.
Thank you, Rachel, for teleporting us back.
You are very welcome.
For those of you who are Star Trek fans, that's what I always think of. Is everyone back?
Yes, everyone is out of the breakout rooms and into the main room.
Okay, we're back. Dr. Telfair, you're on.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I guess the starting off, just to close out part of this, is just to see if anybody want to share anything about the breakout session before we close out. Any last minutes?
It was really helpful to be able to collaborate and have ideas coming from different people from different backgrounds. And so it's important to, not for me to just be sitting in my office thinking, but to have other people who can pour into you and give you some other ideas and other resources. So I really did appreciate the breakout session. It was very, very helpful.
Fantastic.
A great part of the value of the breakout sessions is you have unexpected moments of insight, things that some the people the diversity of the group brings based on their experiences and everything. So the entire workshop has been very valuable. The breakout sessions are also valuable for a different reason. So I think that it really complements one another, and I have appreciated all the information that I've learned. I did share in our room that I'm a complete novice, never done this before. And this makes me almost look forward to my first attempt, as intimidating as it is, but I feel much more prepared, and this is excellent. And as I said in our breakout session, I would highly recommend this to anyone before they get started, or even if they're seasoned, to go back and have this information. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Angel, for those of us who may not know who you are, can you introduce yourself? Because somebody may want to partner with you.
Absolutely. I'm Angel Donardi, and I'm the Associate Director at Life Incorporated in Savannah. And Life stands for Living Independence for Everyone. And we are a disability resource center. So what Life does is we focus on, and the word independence can be a little misleading. No one is completely independent. What we try to do is be supportive of people's efforts to stay out of institutional settings and to stay in the community, be part of the community, and to educate our community about what,
Thank you.
I hate to use the word like ableism, but it's to help understand that people with disabilities belong in their community.
Thank you.
And yeah, it's important that they have those resources. And so what we are is kind of support. We work with people and we allow them dignity of risk to make their own decisions and participate as much as they want to.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay. Independence as they define it. I get it. Okay. Other persons before we close out.
It took the stress out. It wasn't as to come up with Nikki's, I don't know, Nikki, what is that? A pre-grant? Having somebody who can help say this, that, and the other, help take the stress out. And like she said, you can sit in the room and live in your head and come up with these things, but until you get them out of your mouth with people who are there to help you, even with each other, not necessarily with Lizanne and Shirley, but even with each other to help hash it out. It took the stress out.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, Dr. Telfair, I want to interject here that I've got to get past the holidays.
Okay. Right.
But one of the things that Blake Caldwell brilliantly helped us with a few years ago was we started a grant working group, and it was kind of like this. We would bring something that we were working on and talk it through. So in the midst of COVID, I'll offline have discussions with Blake and the other Roberts, and we'll talk about how, to what extent, and maybe somebody from United Way, to what extent we could maybe do that, on a quarterly basis or something like that, to help alleviate some of the stress that goes along with grant writing. So stay tuned.
Well, happy to help if I can. So anybody else? Okay, so so Ms. Conley, as we recommended, it's always good, as I recommended, I think the very couple slide or three, to whenever you work on a grant, work it with somebody else. It's always good. Trust me. Yeah. To this day. So anyway, thanks everyone. I appreciate it. And then I would ask that you press the chat feature, and at the top of the chat feature is day 2 assessment. So it's really easy. If you click on that and fill it out and send it, we appreciate it. Mr. Rojas, I'm sorry. Did you have a comment? No. Okay. So anyway, we hopefully, probably with the help of this, we'll probably repeat this at some point. If that depends on what goes on in the feedback. So my only comment was thank you all for this opportunity, and thank you for bearing with me. I teach a lot online, but this is the first time I've ever done a workshop with this type of thing. So please forgive any kind of errors that I had. Thank you for that. But anyway, please feel free to send us additional comments and information. Please use the references that we have at the back. I wanted to just point that out to you, particularly because it's a lot of free stuff. And included in that free stuff is not just written, but also a visual information. And also several of those sites are interactive, where you could reach out to people on the other end if you have questions and work. In this day and time, I want to echo what Ms. Roberts said. This day and time, we have what I call the trifecta of stuff. COVID is one. The economic challenges we have is none. Social challenges we have with equity and the discrimination, those kinds of things are others, besides just the usual stuff we have to deal with. And so there's a lot of opportunities on those sites where they're really, the funders are looking for your wisdom and trying to work with you and collaborate with you. And I guess that was one thing I probably did not say in the grant, is that many times, particularly local grants are collaborative. In the sense that they're reaching out to you. They're saying, we have money, we want to share, we want to work with you. And that is as important as some of these other things. So I would encourage you to also look for those types that usually sometimes makes for a first grant, if you will, and look at that and then the sites on that. So I'll leave it at that. I appreciate your feedback, and please, my contact information is on the slides. I think it's the first or second slide or whatever. So please feel free to reach out if I can answer any questions or provide more information or whatever. And I want to give a shout out to this partner on this, Ms. Roberts and her shop, and especially the work of the 3 young ladies that work with us, Miss Ando, Miss Chungo, and then Miss Rachel, because I cannot pronounce her last name correctly. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Telfair. Huh? Thank you, Dr. Telfair.
Quite welcome.
And thank you, Blake and Shirley and Nicole. And I want to give a shout out to Nicole. Today's Nicole's official last day with Healthy Savannah, I know. And she's going to Georgia Southern to work. So we're going to really miss you, Nicole, and everything that you've brought to our community in terms of the work and love that you've brought.